It began with a smirk. Inside the polished chamber of the United States Senate, where power is cloaked in rhetoric and posture, the air carried more than formality. It carried tension. A hearing was underway on regulatory overreach, an arena ripe for confrontation. At the center of the discussion sat Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana, flipping through a thick binder of documents, calmly observing the proceedings with an expression more amused than alarmed. Then came the jab. A veteran senator from the Northeast leaned into his microphone, his tone dry and deliberate. "I respect my colleague from Louisiana," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "But we're not arguing in a barnyard courtroom. This isn't a case for a country lawyer." A few chuckles broke out. Kennedy didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, placed his binder aside, and with his signature drawl, thick, deliberate, and as unmistakably Southern as sweet tea in August, he responded. "Well, Senator," he began, eyes narrowing just a touch, "I may be just a country lawyer, but even us rural folks know the difference between regulatory authority and statutory overreach. If I may, I believe Title V of the United States Code, Section 706, specifically outlines that a reviewing court shall hold unlawful and set aside agency action found to be in excess of statutory jurisdiction." The room fell silent. The smirks faded. Before we dive deeper into this clash of wit and law, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our deep dives into politics, power, and unforgettable moments like this one. John Neely Kennedy is no stranger to being underestimated. With a voice that sounds like it's echoing from a front porch in rural Louisiana and a cadence more suited to storytelling than high-stakes politics, he often invites dismissal. But behind the slow charm is a razor-sharp intellect. Educated at Vanderbilt, the University of Virginia School of Law, and Oxford University, Kennedy combines Ivy League polish with Southern grit, and he uses it strategically. Born in Centerville, Mississippi, and raised in Zachary, Louisiana, Kennedy built his career not on pedigree but persistence. He rose through the legal ranks with methodical precision, serving as Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Revenue before running for Senate. But it wasn't his resume that made him famous. It was his mouth. His quips have been described as homespun, his barbs laced with metaphors drawn from cattle farms and catfish ponds. Critics call him theatrical. Supporters call him brilliant. Either way, no one denies that Kennedy knows how to hold a room. The senator who mocked him that day didn't realize he was walking into a trap. Kennedy's style may evoke Andy Griffith, but his strategy is closer to Machiavelli with a dash of Mark Twain. He lets his opponents feel superior, then dismantles them with precision and poise. And in the Senate hearing that day, he did exactly that. The setting couldn't have been more symbolic. A hearing meant to dissect the limits of government power became a battleground over perception. Was Kennedy a caricature of rural Americana, or was he a master of legal nuance hiding in plain sight? With the quote of a federal statute, Kennedy didn't just defend his argument, he flipped the narrative. No longer the butt of a joke, he became its author. And in Washington, where image is everything, few things are more powerful than turning a punchline into a platform. The senator's face hardened, his earlier smirk replaced by the tight expression of someone suddenly aware he had misjudged his opponent. Around the chamber, aides glanced at each other, noting the shift. Kennedy hadn't just recited the law, he'd reshaped the debate. And he wasn't finished. With the same calm tone, Kennedy continued. "Now, I'm just a simple man from Louisiana, but I do believe Section 706 tells us that if an agency acts beyond what Congress authorized, it's not only improper, it's illegal." He paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at his colleague. "Even us country lawyers can read plain English." A ripple moved through the chamber. There were no more chuckles. This wasn't the first time Kennedy had used charm and precision to disarm an adversary. Back in his days as Louisiana's state treasurer, he developed a reputation for grilling financial executives with a mix of humor and surgical questioning. His signature style, disarm with folksiness then strike with facts, earned him both ridicule and respect. In courtrooms and committee rooms alike, Kennedy leaned on deep preparation and legal rigor to win battles that often started with his opponents underestimating him. One former clerk recalled an early case in Baton Rouge where Kennedy, faced with a barrage of jargon from a high-powered firm, dismantled the entire argument by referencing a rarely cited tax code provision. He'd done his homework, the clerk said, but more than that, he knew when to strike. He waited and then he used it like a blade. That same instinct was on display in the Senate hearing. The jab about being a country lawyer wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger narrative that Kennedy had spent his career fighting. In a world that often equated rural origins with intellectual inferiority, Kennedy stood as a rebuttal. And his method wasn't to deny his roots, it was to weaponize them. You see, he'd once told a reporter, people listen when they think you're simple. Then you've got the element of surprise. That's when the real argument begins. As Kennedy spoke in the hearing, his words drew attention beyond the room. Staffers began whispering. One aide discreetly texted, "He just quoted federal code like it was a nursery rhyme." On social media, clips of the exchange began to spread. The video was short, less than a minute, but it captured something rare. A reversal of expectations so clean, so immediate, that it demanded to be watched again. Across cable networks, anchors replayed the clip with fascination. Who was this senator with the drawl of a storyteller and the brain of a litigator? Analysts debated whether it was a performance or a genuine display of intellectual muscle. But for those who had followed Kennedy's rise, it wasn't surprising. He had always embraced contradiction. He was both refined and rustic, charming and calculating. He quoted Faulkner and federal statutes in the same breath. And he had learned long ago that being underestimated was not a disadvantage. It was a strategy. The senator who had launched the insult tried to recover, shifting the discussion back to policy. But the moment had already turned. Kennedy, with a polite smile and a subtle nod, had won the room. Not with volume, not with theatrics, but with the one thing that still held weight in Washington, mastery of the facts. And as the hearing moved forward, it became clear. The real battle wasn't about regulations, it was about perception. By the end of that week, the clip of John Neely Kennedy quoting federal code had racked up over 2 million views online. It was shared across political lines, not just by conservatives who admired the takedown, but also by centrists and independents curious about the man behind the accent. To some, it was performance art. To others, it was vindication. And then came the headlines. Don't let the drawl fool you. Country lawyer outsmarts the Beltway. Kennedy's viral moment wasn't luck, it was law. The narrative was changing, not just inside the Capitol, but across the country. John Neely Kennedy was no longer the quirky senator with pithy soundbites. He was becoming something else entirely, a political enigma. And in a landscape saturated with scripted personas, that mystery made him magnetic. But behind the virality was something far more personal. Kennedy hadn't always been seen as clever or quick. As a boy in Zachary, Louisiana, he was labeled bookish by his peers and too serious by his teachers. He'd spend afternoons in the public library, poring over history books while others played football. His parents, working class, proud and deeply rooted, taught him early the value of preparation. His father, a utility worker, told him once, "You may not be the loudest, son, but you can be the most ready." Those words stayed with him. When he left Louisiana for Vanderbilt, he encountered a new world of wealth, polish and pedigree. The accent that had been invisible back home now marked him as different, but he kept it, not out of defiance but identity. Later at Oxford, he learned the subtle art of verbal sparring among British scholars. It was there he began to realize that intelligence wasn't just about what you knew, it was about how and when you used it. So when the spotlight turned to him after the Senate hearing, Kennedy didn't recoil. He leaned in. Reporters started calling his office. Interviews followed. When asked about his viral moment, he replied, "I'm not surprised they didn't expect it. Folks rarely do, but I do read the bills." That line itself went viral. Inside his Senate office, staffers began to notice a shift. The phones rang more often. Supporters sent messages of admiration, many from small towns and rural counties. They saw in Kennedy something familiar, a refusal to be embarrassed by simplicity and a quiet pride in being underestimated. To them, he wasn't just a politician. He was proof that dignity didn't require approval from Washington elites. Meanwhile, political analysts scrambled to interpret his rise. Was it all deliberate? Was Kennedy playing a deeper game? Opinions varied. Some argued he was crafting a brand, one part homespun wit, one part constitutional steel. Others believed he was simply being himself, and that authenticity, in an era of filtered personas, was his real weapon. In the halls of the Capitol, fellow senators began approaching him differently. They watched their words more carefully. They prepared more thoroughly before entering hearings where Kennedy was present. His reputation had shifted from entertaining to formidable. But Kennedy didn't celebrate. He returned to work like always, quiet, consistent, and focused. When asked later about the senator who had called him a country lawyer, Kennedy only smiled. I suppose he just didn't know I had the whole country in my corner. And he did. In diners across Iowa, barbershops in Georgia, and truck stops in Missouri, people were talking. Not about bills or votes, but about a moment when a man with an accent and a binder reminded the country that intelligence doesn't always wear a tailored suit. The Senate chamber was quieter than usual. A new round of hearings had begun, and once again Senator John Neely Kennedy was seated near the center, reviewing notes. The topic this time: environmental policy and the limits of executive power. His previous performance still echoed through the Capitol, but now there was a different energy. Eyes watched him, not with dismissal, but with caution. The same senator who had mocked Kennedy before returned to the spotlight, now determined to reclaim lost ground. He launched into a lengthy argument about environmental regulation, invoking a tangle of technical terms, scientific models, and projected data. Then, as if to set a trap, he turned directly to Kennedy. "Perhaps the senator from Louisiana," he said, "would like to explain to us how Section 113 of the Clean Air Act squares with his theory of statutory restraint." There was a pause. The bait had been laid. Kennedy looked up, fingers gently resting on his binder. "I'd be happy to, Senator," he replied, voice steady. "Section 113 deals with enforcement proceedings and administrative penalties. It does not grant any agency the authority to redefine emission standards beyond what Congress explicitly authorized in Section 111. If you'd like, I can read both aloud. No theatrics." No sarcasm, just a precise surgical correction. It landed like a gavel strike. The room didn't erupt, but something deeper happened. Respect settled in. Even those who disagreed with Kennedy's politics acknowledged the mastery in his delivery. He had just taken the most complex question of the day and distilled it down to its legal essence. No grandstanding, just facts. And that was his advantage. In a political era dominated by spectacle, Kennedy understood the power of quiet certainty. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to insult, to undermine. His tools were patience, clarity, and an encyclopedic grasp of the law. The kind of arsenal that didn't dazzle, it dismantled. The rival senator shifted uncomfortably, attempting to pivot the conversation. But the damage was done. On social media, the moment was clipped again. Within hours, it circulated with captions like, "He did it again," and "Don't test Kennedy on the law." In one segment, a commentator on a major news network remarked, "Kennedy isn't just a colorful voice, he's a constitutional weapon." The emotional peak came not from outrage or passion, but from something far rarer in Washington: clarity. As Kennedy concluded his remarks, even members of the opposing party nodded slightly. It wasn't agreement, it was recognition. There are moments in politics where the noise dies down, where facts cut through ideology, and where substance defeats spin. Kennedy had found that moment again, not by accident but by preparation. When asked later how he stayed so composed, he replied, "I don't see the point in yelling when the facts are already louder than the noise." And as the hearing moved forward, it was clear. Kennedy's words would outlast the session. His reputation had evolved beyond mere political style. He was now a figure defined by unexpected depth, a man whose every word carried the weight of someone who had done the reading, done the thinking, and knew exactly when to speak. Outside, as journalists prepared their evening segments, the headline practically wrote itself: Kennedy, the Quiet Storm. In the weeks that followed, Senator John Neely Kennedy's status continued to rise, not just in media cycles, but in political calculus. What began as a moment of rebuttal had grown into a full-scale re-evaluation of his role in the national conversation. No longer seen as a sideline commentator, Kennedy was now a contender, respected, watched, and in some corners, quietly feared. He didn't gloat. That wasn't his style. Instead, he kept to his routine: hearings, committee briefings, late-night reading. The same quiet diligence that had carried him from the backroads of Louisiana to the halls of Oxford was still guiding him now. But behind the scenes, conversations were shifting. Influential figures began whispering his name in contexts that had never been whispered before. Leadership roles, national platforms, even the kind of speculation reserved for bigger ambitions. What made Kennedy so compelling was not just his intellect or delivery, it was the sense that he hadn't changed to fit the mold. He didn't tailor his speech to match DC's polished cadence. He didn't discard his background to seem sophisticated. Instead, he invited the world to underestimate him, and then made them regret it. In one late-night interview, a veteran political strategist said, "Kennedy is the rare kind of figure who wins because people don't take him seriously. And by the time they do, he's already won." His rise wasn't about viral clips. It was about something deeper, the return of substance. While others performed, Kennedy prepared. While others postured, he executed. It was a style that felt almost old-fashioned, and maybe that's why it worked. For many Americans, he became a symbol of possibility. A reminder that intelligence isn't always loud, and dignity isn't always packaged. People saw in him the power of staying grounded, of using humor as armor and knowledge as ammunition. From working-class voters to law students in crowded classrooms, Kennedy's name came up not as a curiosity, but as a case study, and he seemed unfazed. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, Kennedy simply said, "As someone who knew the rules, played the game fair, and didn't blink when challenged." That was all. If you enjoyed this story of unexpected brilliance in the heart of Washington, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next episode. His story didn't end with a mic drop or a viral punchline. It continued in the quiet work of governance, in the lines of legal text he memorized, in the moments when others stumbled, and he stood firm. For Kennedy, the reward wasn't fame, it was clarity. And in the murky world of politics, that clarity made him dangerous. As his colleagues continued to clash in soundbites, Kennedy kept quoting code. And in doing so, he reminded the nation of something too often forgotten, that the Constitution doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the most prepared. Click on the video on your screen now to dive into another unbelievable moment from the U.S. Senate floor. Back in Louisiana at a town hall, an older man approached him after a long Q&A session. "I showed him, Senator," he said with a grin. Kennedy just tipped his head and replied, "I reckon I just read the fine print." And maybe that was the point all along.